Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're going to do something a little different. We are going to dive straight into a universally accepted piece of wisdom and, well, completely dismantle it to figure out what actually drives human potential. We've all heard the phrase, right? We've pretty much internalized it as an absolute truth, but today we're putting it under the microscope. We're looking at a truly fascinating translation of an essay by the authors Shou Feng, and it is going to really challenge how we think about things. Knowledge is power. You know it. I know it. For centuries, schools, parents, and teachers have leaned heavily on this famous phrase coined by the 17th century British philosopher Francis Bacon. It's basically the ultimate promise to students, isn't it? The idea is, hey, do your homework, pass your tests, gather all this knowledge, and boom, you'll supposedly have all the power you need to achieve your dreams after graduation.
But here is where it gets interesting. The text we're exploring today asks a deeply disruptive, almost uncomfortable question. What if Francis Bacon was just entirely wrong? Like, what if amassing a ton of knowledge doesn't actually give you any real power at all? It's a super provocative thought, I know, but the source text makes an incredibly compelling case that, for generations, we've actually been confusing the simple accumulation of facts with true actionable capability.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the Great Knowledge Myth. The source material kicks things off with just a brilliant analogy. I want you to imagine your brain as this magnificent, sprawling library. Now, it holds an absolute wealth of knowledge, right? It forms a really solid foundation. But think about it. A building stuffed full of books possesses zero inherent power. It literally just sits there. The text argues that having a huge foundation of knowledge doesn't automatically generate actual power. It really just means you happen to have a very well-stocked mental storage room. And if we dig into the very origins of our knowledge, the text points out a fundamental flaw. Our knowledge mostly comes from our sense organs. Now, the Greek philosopher Protagoras famously claimed humans are the measure of everything, but the essay notes that even Francis Bacon himself had to admit that our senses are limited. They just can't accurately measure all things. So logically, if our senses are fundamentally limited, trying to judge and measure the entirety of reality based purely on that restricted knowledge, well, it's inherently flawed. To really drive this point home, the author uses a pretty provocative thought experiment to show the limits of academic knowledge. Picture this. You've got an interviewer sitting across from two different people. On one side, there's a young woman with only a middle school diploma. On the other side, a mature, older woman holding a doctorate degree. The text asks us to pause and consider which of these two individuals is more likely to arouse the interviewer's rich imagination, dramatically alter their mood, and motivate intense vitality. Neutrally evaluating this specific scenario presented in the source, the argument being made is that raw human elements, things like beauty, youth, and vitality, can actually evoke a much stronger, much more visceral reaction than a piece of paper proving a doctorate. It's a really fascinating way to highlight a specific point. If a PhD cannot compete with raw human nature when it comes to generating an immediate, powerful response, then academic knowledge alone simply cannot be the ultimate, absolute power we've made it out to be.
Moving right along to Section 2, Limitations and Dangers. Let's see where this gets risky.
The author goes on to list several archaic proverbs and prejudices that, historically, were treated as absolute, unquestionable factual knowledge. We're talking about incredibly rigid rules dictating marriage, incredibly strict definitions of filial piety, sweeping declarations about sin, and dogmatic beliefs about enduring hardship. For thousands of years, people just blindly accepted these rules as undeniable life knowledge. But the text makes the case that treating these rigid, inflexible concepts as infallible guides has actually brought immense anguish and suffering to generations. It's categorized here as a severe cognitive misconception. And this brilliantly highlights the real danger. The author points out that objective reality is, by its very nature, always changing. But when society stubbornly applies traditional, dead knowledge, like rigid religious dogmas or totally outdated norms about parenting, that knowledge actually becomes reactionary. It actively resists social development. So instead of empowering us, clinging to this prejudicial knowledge actively impedes natural human liberation. It essentially holds us captive to the past. Which perfectly sets up Section 3. Thinking outperforms knowing. If dead knowledge is the problem, what's the solution?
Well, the text argues that our most powerful intellectual force isn't our ability to memorize stuff, but rather our capacity for flexible, tactful thinking. And honestly, there is no better example of this than Albert Einstein. Just consider his famous thought experiment. He asked himself, how would I perceive the universe if I were riding on a beam of light? That is pure imagination at work.
The crucial point here is that Einstein's immense power didn't come merely from the static facts he had memorized. It came from his wild imagination and dynamic thinking. The author places this in stark contrast to people who just gather endless diplomas and read countless books, but end up forming completely rigid, inflexible mindsets. Getting more degrees doesn't equal more power if it traps you in a static way of looking at the world. Bottom line, thinking dynamically vastly outperforms simply knowing statically.
And that brings us to the final part of our explainer, Section 4, the core of lasting power.
The author arrives at a really fascinating conclusion here. Lasting power? It doesn't come from memorized facts. It doesn't even come from massive economic strength or giant national defense forces. Instead, the source argues that true power is built sequentially through core human virtues. Think about it. Sincere deeds actually have power. Kind behavior has power. Love is a remarkably powerful force. People who keep their faith and actually practice honesty inherently wield power. It is our character, not our mental data storage, that creates a lasting impact on the world. So, the ultimate takeaway from this source material is a massive warning against stagnation. We are advised to absolutely stop wasting our precious time simply reciting former knowledge. I mean, sure, it has its place. As a foundation, we need that. But we have to take pains to develop our dynamic way of thinking. You literally cannot successfully navigate a constantly changing living reality if you are stubbornly trying to judge it with dead, prejudicial knowledge.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to chew on as you step back into your day. Are you just building a static library in your mind, endlessly chasing dead knowledge? Or are you actively cultivating those dynamic virtues we talked about, sincerity, kindness, love, and the flexible thinking that creates true, lasting power? It's a totally different way to look at human potential, and honestly, it just might change how you approach learning from here on out. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating perspective with me on The Explainer today, and remember, keep thinking flexibly.